Hello everyone, good afternoon. So I hope we are live and you are listening to this video. Please post a comment box if this video, post a comment in the comment box if this video reaches you. So today we are supposed to study a Renaissance theatre. Renaissance theatre is one of the most important avenues of learning Shakespeare. Shakespeare was not merely a dramatist of exceptional merit. Shakespeare was also a theatrician of great stature. So, before we go into Shakespearean plays in detail, about before we dwell on the different aspects of Shakespearean theatre or Shakespearean drama, it's pertinent to know about the cultural history of Renaissance or early modern theatre as it was. So this class devotes itself totally to the exploration of the early modern politics and its link with the early modern theatre as such. You all know that in 1600 in 1600 or in the 17th in the early 17th century or in the late 16th century, we have a rise of theater. We have a flourish of theater. Theater flourished in many ways, and it's often treated to be the golden age for theater. In Renaissance times, if we think about the tenure of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, who comes to the throne in 1558, there were some ordinances, there were some orders that that the theater had to be made in a particular light. The theater had to be done in a particular light. So, the idea of censorship, the idea of controlling theater was very much part of Renaissance cultural discourse. If I read out a portion from Elizabeth's ordinance, Elizabeth's order, it pronounces like this, that wherein either wherein either matters of religion or of the governance of the state of the commonwealth shall be handled or treated. So you cannot perform anything that directly deals with the question of governance or the question of religion. So the power of the theater was curbed in a way. So in Renaissance times, in the times of Elizabeth, the ordinance that was issued, that was ratified, talked about the the presentation of theatre in a manner that it should not provoke any political or religious turbulence. So it should not cause any political or religious turbulence. So it cannot be overtly political, it cannot be overtly religious. So it has to have a neutral stance in the Renaissance times, and that's what Elizabeth propounded through the order issued in 1559, Elizabeth the First. So you clearly understand that the idea of controlling theatre, the idea of censoring theatre or circumscribing theatre to a particular direction was intrinsic to Renaissance politics. এই যে রেনেসান্স রাজনীতির মধ্যে কিন্তু থিয়েটারকে কন্ট্রোল করা, থিয়েটারকে নিয়ে একটা একটা খপের মধ্যে বন্দি করে দেওয়া যে থিয়েটার কি বলবে না বলবে, সো এই বক্তব্য ঠিক করে দেওয়ার জায়গা কিন্তু চলে আসছে। So you find in Renaissance times that people are thinking about the modalities of theater, how theater should operate, how theater should act, how theater should be circulated across the globe. This modality was set by the Renaissance Queen Elizabeth. So in a way, in the Renaissance time, you find a direct interlink between theater and politics. Theater was not treated independently of the political sphere. It was not art for art's sake. So Renaissance time did not give artistic freedom, uh, artistic liberty, a open space, a level playing ground. Rather, the artistic liberty was always under the surveillance of the Renaissance politics. This question of politicizing theatre, this question of making theatre part of the Renaissance body politic is intrinsic to our reading of Shakespeare, is intrinsic to our analysis of Shakespeare. That theatre is something that is not independent of our life. Theatre should be under the under the under the purview of politics, and this association between the theatrical sphere and the political sphere leads to our reading of Shakespeare. Shakespeare, in a way, balances the two. Shakespeare is a great balancer. He balances the theatrical power of stage through projecting some transcendental subjects, and also he keeps his allegiance to the state intact by circumscribing his individual characters. And therefore, Macbeth was a transgression. Macbeth is someone who breaks the codes of Elizabethan governance, Elizabethan spirit, Elizabethan humanism. But ultimately, Macbeth is chained back or pinned down to a position where he had not been. So, this idea of balancing, this idea of scaling oneself up and pulling the person down is operative in Shakespeare. Shakespeare was quite close to the Elizabethan theatre politics. Elizabethan, uh, he was patronized by the Elizabethan state. So this interlink between state and artistry was very much there in the Renaissance times. Let us talk about briefly about the environment of Renaissance theatre. Yes, in Renaissance time, you find the revival of the ancient theatre. We all know that theatre comes from Greece, ancient Greece. It's a classical art form, and in Renaissance times we find a revival of it, a revival of theatre as a vital institution. And the aim of Renaissance theatre was not aesthetic, it was predominantly moral, it was predominantly ethical. So one has to have an ethical virtue projected on the stage in order to make the theater a perfect one. So every theatrical performance was supposed to convey a moral or ethical message. Every theatrical performance was supposed to reach to its people through an ethical or moral platform. Now, this was predominantly the agenda of the Shakespearean theatre. In Shakespearean theatre, you have in Renaissance theatre rather, you have a book called Institution Principis Christiania. Institution. I will send the names later to you. Institution Principis Christiania. So, in this book, Erasmus talks about the Erasmus. I talked about Erasmus' Praise of Folly, right, in the last class, and Erasmus will talk about that how one differs from uh, the idea of acting and the idea of kingship. So, how there is a difference between the idea of kingship and idea of acting. And what is the difference between acting and kingship? In acting, you are performing a role of a king, and while performing, you have to keep in mind that your moral virtues, your moral lessons remain intact. They do not get tarnished in any way. So, the question of morality, the question of ethics, the question of virtue should remain intrinsic to the human soul. It should not it should not uh, in any way compromise. It should not deviate from its actual intention. So the real king has to be good, and the actor who is performing the king should possess that virtues, should have to recreate that virtues. In this context, it is important to speak about Niccolo Machiavelli. And Niccolo Machiavelli's idea of virtue, virtu. And in Machiavelli's concept of political thinking or virtue, you find that Machiavelli endorses the use of reason, use of political reason in order to rule a state. So when you rule a state, you have to be politically very acute. You have to be politically very shrewd, politically very astute, and in this political astuteness, you can violate ethical rules if required. So ethics can be violated according to Machiavellian principle that you can violate ethics if you have to rule a state. So the political power, the politics of Machiavelli should does not necessarily conform to an ethical design. So there is a separation between ethics and politics in Machiavelli. Before this, before Machiavelli, what we find? We find that there is an increasing thrust on the idea of ethics, that one has to be morally good, one has to be ethically noble. As we talked about the Renaissance philosopher, the question, the principal thrust was on the idea of morality, the idea of ethics. But in Machiavelli, we find there is a departure from the idea of predominant ethical goodness. Rather, Machiavelli talks about that the commitment, the king has a fundamental commitment to his state, or a queen has fundamental commitment to her state, to her body politic. And if the queen or the king seeks recourse to, or if the queen or the king seeks resort to any kind of deceit, any kind of political astuteness, which is politically beneficial, it can be justified. So it does not always mean that you have to adopt an ethical position to rule a state. You have to be politically very shrewd. You have to be politically very astute in order to rule a state. So this junction between the political sphere and the ethical sphere leads to a redefinition of the Renaissance politics. In Renaissance politics, which was predominantly morality based, ethic, ethics based, we now find an amalgamation between morality and politics, ethics and politics. Okay, so that's why in Renaissance theatre also you find its reflection, you find its power. Hitherto, it was all about the goodness. In the times of Erasmus, in 1516, it was all about the replication of goodness, replication of virtues, replication of noble acts by the performers. But later on, there is a shift, and in this shift you find it's not merely about the goodness, it's also about the intelligence of the actor to perform what is happening around. A performer is not merely an idealized citizen. A performer is not a bodiless performer, an abstract human being. Rather, a performer is a human being of flesh and blood. And therefore, a performer has emotions. A performer has moments of moral degeneration. A performer has moments of apathy. A performer has moments of let's say moments of disappointment, and so on. So a performer is an emotional being. A performer can perform according to his moods. This idea was propagated in the Renaissance times. This idea was seen in the Renaissance time, and Renaissance time, quite as opposed to the propounded by Erasmus, idea propounded by Erasmus, and that's why there is a duality in the notion of individual in the Renaissance theatre. At one level, the human being was treated to be a spiritualized, uh, bodiless, perfect entity. That individual had to attain perfection through performance. At another level, the individual could perform himself or herself in its real form. Another very important point is in Renaissance times, women were not allowed to perform. So, who used to perform in their place? It was boy actors who had to cross dress themselves to perform the roles of women. As a result, you find, if you read Macbeth, now, well, we will begin Macbeth very soon. So we find that the witches, the witches who are performing in Macbeth, they have beards, right? So it was actually the old characters, old men characters, they were cross dressing as witches, and therefore their beards were visible. Their beards were visible. Uh, Women were not allowed to perform as witches, even if the idea of witchcraft was there, even if the concept of demonology was there, but women were not allowed to go outside their household and perform on the Renaissance stage, as the sexual ambience was so restrictive in the Renaissance time that it was not at all permissive about women's sexuality. It was not at all permissive about the question of women's liberty in the context of performance. You can read an essay by Joan Kelly in this context, and the essay is entitled as "Did Women Have a Renaissance?" I will send you the essay. Did women have a renaissance? And it shows that women didn't actually have any kind of renaissance because their position remained the same within the household of domesticity. Even if they were transgressive women, they were domesticated by the patriarchal politics. And there is a play by Shakespeare called Taming of the Shrew, and here you find that how a transgressive, defiant woman is restricted or domesticated within the household. Also, in Renaissance time, you find a book entitled Treatise de Architectura. Treatise de Architectura. It's written by Alberti. And in Treatise de Architectura, Alberti uses the word theatre as a mode of communication, as a mode of concourse and communion. So, theatre is a space where you find heterogeneous group of audience coming together. Here you find people from different social strata amalgamate, people from different social strata coalesce. It's a space of communion. And he uses the word theatre, and he shows that the word theatre is derived from the word theatro, and theatro means visario. Visario is vision. Theater, theatro, visario. Visario is vision. Vision. So you witness. So the role of the audience was to look at the performers performing. So it was about an interface between the performer and the audience. If there was no performer, if there were no audience, theater wouldn't be taken place. So the theater is incomplete without audience. দর্শক না থাকলে theater হবে না. So the question of visario, the vision, that you have to, the performer would look up to the audience reception while performing, and the audience would look at the performer while consuming or while watching the theater. So it was a reciprocal process. It was an ongoing process. It was a process of interplay between the audience and the performers. অডিয়েন্স এবং পারফর্মারের মধ্যে একটা যেন ইন্টারপ্লে চলছে, একটা অনগোয়িং প্রসেস চলছে, সেই জায়গাটা কিন্তু থিয়েটার এনশিওর করেছিল. থিয়েটার এনশিওরড অ্যান ইন্টারপ্লে বিটুইন audience and performers. So this is how the Renaissance theatre brought together a wide array of people under the academic Olympico or different theatrical spaces. In England, let's come to the context of England. In England, there were traveling troops of 4 to 6 men who used to perform across different parts of England. And their chief theatrical patron was Earl of Leicester Robert Dudley. Robert Dudley was the chief theatrical patron of the English theatre in the 16th century. Between 1552 to 1585, between 1582 and 1585, there is a remarkable change in the theatre environment of England, and Robert Dudley suddenly disappears from the scene, and the state monopoly was consolidated. Initially, I talked about how Renaissance politics had a pivotal role in shaping the dimensions of theatre, in shaping how theatre was performed, how theatre should be performed rather. So the question of connecting theatre was and politics was very much there in the air. And also, after Robert Dudley's departure, we find the direct intervention of the state into the theatrical policies. And you find, let me read a portion. Just a new company, perhaps Leicester's Man, under a new name was formed by two senior government officials, since Sir Francis Walsingham and Edmund Tilney. So, two senior officials took over. First one was Francis Walsingham and Edmund Tilney. Francis Walsingham and Edmund Tilney took over after Robert Dudley's departure. And also in London, the theatres were mostly in the suburb areas. And there were four theatre spaces. Number one, Theatre in Shoreditch. The Theatre in Shoreditch was established in 1576. Theatre in the Carton in Holywell, Carton in the Holywell. So Shoreditch was there. The Carton Theatre was in Holywell. Carton Theatre ছবি আমি তোমাদের পরের দিন দেখাবো. Carton was in the Holywell, and Rose Theatre was on the bank side of on the southern bank of London. Southern bank of London. It was established in 1587, and Swan, another theatre. So there were four principal theatre spaces where these plays were performed, and they were open air theatre. The virtually circular amphitheaters. You all know what an amphitheater is, and these theaters were predominantly amphitheater. And in 1594, it was agreed by the Queen's Privy Council and the Lord Mayor of London that Inns Saraikana could no longer be used, and just two parties, the Chamberlain's Man and at the Admiralsman, would be licensed to play at two designated suburban playhouses, the Theatre of Shoreditch and Rose, on the Bankside respectively. So এখানে এর মধ্যেও একটা পলিটিক্স ঢুকে যায়, এবং only Chamberlain's-men and Admiral's-men were allowed to perform in the two most respected playhouses of London, the Theatre of Shoreditch and the Theatre of Rose. So that is how Queen Elizabeth played a pivotal role in shaping the theatrical performance of Renaissance theatre. In Shakespeare, we find multiple references to the contemporary social and political aspects of drama, how the individualism was challenged, and how the codes of conduct were violated, how an individual transgressed, and how that transgressor was removed by another person who came to restore the balance. So this is how an interplay of power and powerlessness. This is how an interplay between the person who is at the foreground of monarchy and someone who is aspiring to claim that position went on in the Renaissance drama. So Renaissance drama is actually a battle of power. Renaissance drama offers a site where you find the contestation and negotiation between several forces, between several ideas, several sensibilities, several aspects of religion, and so on. So that's why Renaissance drama or Renaissance theatre is often called early modern theatre. In Renaissance theatre, you find the modern aspect of man's individuation. So, man's individuation outside the fold of religion. Religion was there in the medieval era, and religion used to curb individual within a specific position, within a specific region, within a specific area. And in the Renaissance times, you find the revival of the individual from this stupor, the revival of individual from this stultifying confinement, and the individual seeks to assert its position. Sometimes it's about ethics, sometimes it's about politics, sometimes it's about an amalgamation between ethics and politics, sometimes it's the rise of the radical self, sometimes it's the rise of the spiritual self, sometimes it's the rise of the philosophical self. So all these things are intermingled, are intermeshed in the Renaissance theatre. That's why Renaissance theatre, despite the political intervention, despite the political surveillance, had not lost its power to unsettle the governments, unsettle the contemporary social scenario. And in Renaissance, I think Renaissance theatre was very much influenced by the contemporary social problems, social scenario, and it also played a very decisive influence in instigating a social and structural shifts, instigating a social and structural shift in the Renaissance public sphere, in the Renaissance public sphere. So the power of the theatre had a direct bearing on the role of individual, how the role of individual could be observed or could be conceptualized, was directly related to the subversive power of the theatre. So the theatre not merely subverted the contemporary code of conduct, it also conformed to them. So this subversion containment duality was there, as Stephen Greenblatt. There is a book by Stephen Greenblatt, Shakespearean Negotiations and Invisible Bullets, and in that I will share that essay with you, Invisible Bullets. And in that essay, Greenblatt shows the subversion containment dialectic that is operative in the Renaissance time. And the subversion containment dialectic was quite intrinsic to the Renaissance times as well, quite intrinsic to the Renaissance theatre as well. So the Renaissance theatre was not merely influenced by the social contradictions, social problems, social issues. It also had a direct bearing on transforming the social problems, on giving vent to the audacity of man. So this is how Renaissance theatre was integrally entwined with the Renaissance self-fashioning, and it gave vent to the audacity of hope. It gave vent to the audacity of transcendence. It gave vent to the audacity of transgression, despite the looming fears of political surveillance. So, this is where I end my class today. Thank you for listening. I hope you stay well, stay safe, stay fine. And if you have any question, please write back to me. I will answer this. So this is where I stop today. And if you have any query, you can write to me in the WhatsApp group. And please don't share this link outside the group that you are in. Okay, this link is only for the students of Gokhale College, not for others. Okay, thank you so much.